This is part 2 of the lecture about the national to state relationship. And this lecture is going to talk about what is sometimes called the intergovernmental lobby. And so what that means with inter, meaning it's between governments. And in a federalist system, specifically between different levels of government, how they lobby or work with, cooperate with, persuade one another for policies and interactions that are favorable to them. Okay, so let's go. Initially, when the Constitution was written, and we've talked about this, the House represented the people's interests, and the Senate was to represent the interests of the states in this national government with this new relationship. As we grew as a nation and we expanded, it became obvious that in some respects we were reinventing the wheel over and over and over again with regard to the states. I mean, I think there are advantages to letting every state experiment and do things that suit them, but there can also be a little of that reinvent the wheel feel to it. So as we moved westward, more and more states developed, and they began to see some very common issues and common problems. And so in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt brought the nation's governors together to discuss some common problems. These, the ones he called them together to discuss, dealt with conservation and resource usage. And often states have the same kinds of disagreements and issues when it comes to cooperating with one another. And so he thought, well, you know, many minds brainstorming together is better than one or two. So let's pull everybody together and let's say, what do we see that's a common issue, and how did you solve it, Wisconsin, and how about you, Georgia, and Maine, what have you got to add? You know, that kind of thing. And it was pretty successful. They came up with some common ideas that might work in a variety of places. And so they would meet just periodically, very informally. With the passage of the 17th Amendment, which deals with direct election of senators, the states lost their direct voice in Washington. And at that point, this relationship becomes a little bit more important because no longer are they voting on legislation that might impact and affect the states. Now they've lost that vote and that voice. The state legislatures have. So in the early 60s, this organization formally organized as the National Governors Association. And they meet regularly. They have regional associations. There's the Southeastern Governors Association, the Northwestern Governors Association, etc. There's other little breakdowns of groups, the Republican governors, the Democratic governors, and so on. And they have worked to become a lobbying force on behalf of the states to the national government. So if legislation comes up that could be beneficial or detrimental to the states, they're going to send their lobbying representatives to Washington to talk to Congress about it and try to get changes that are more beneficial to the states rather than harmful or detrimental to the states, in their opinion. Now, there are many today who think that the National Governors Association has been replaced by what they call the Big Seven. And this includes, as you can see on the screen, this includes a number of organizations that represent state government, whether it's at the state level, the governors, and then the legislature, so more than one branch, also state governments in general, cities, counties, city-county management, mayors. So all levels are lobbying and working with one another. More and more, they have begun to focus their efforts not just on lobbying the national government for policy that's good for the states, but they're also beginning to coordinate with one another. You know, it's not serendipitous or coincidental that when Alabama passed the immigration law a few years ago, that Arizona also passed one, and several other states. Indiana had one. Several states did, and it's because they get together at these meetings and they start talking about and brainstorming, and they've moved past just brainstorming, and they've moved past just lobbying Congress for legislation to say, what areas do we want common legislation? An example of that would be the immigration law we talked about. Also, the Common Core. that you've heard some things on the news about with regard to education policy. Some people paint that as Washington's telling us what to do, especially in a sort of states' rights state like Alabama. But that's not completely accurate. The Common Core was initiated through this intergovernmental lobby who were tired of Washington telling them what to do about education, because education is supposed to be a state function, and said, what can we come up with instead? What can we coordinate with one another that is more acceptable to us rather than being subject just to No Child Left Behind, which pretty much everybody in education and even more increasingly in government as well understand has just been a disaster. And so the Common Core at least started as a way for the states to work together to come up with some common standards that they hoped they would then be released from the requirements of No Child Left Behind, to develop policy together and say, hey, what are skills we need for the good of the country that we can develop in children regardless of where they live? And we're increasingly mobile, and kids and their families move from state to state to state, and sometimes they are kind of left behind as they move from state to state. So let's just coordinate policy and have some standards that are the same no matter where you are. And so that is a trend that this intergovernmental lobby is showing, as well as lobbying Washington for things that they think are more beneficial to the states. Now, what if none of these parties can get together and make it work? The Supreme Court is basically an umpire. The Constitution says that if there are disputes between the states, two states are in disagreement maybe over the usage of a resource. For instance, there's an ongoing dispute between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida over water rights to the Chattahoochee River. It is in mediation to make an interstate compact. But what if the states still can't work it out? What if they make a compact and somebody violates it and they want a remedy? Well, the Constitution says the Supreme Court will mediate. It wouldn't be right for state courts to do it. Wouldn't really even be right for it to be done at a district court or appellate court level, because there still may be some state loyalties in there. So it'll be decided by the Supreme Court. Likewise, if there's a dispute between the national government and the states, or a state, it would go straight to the Supreme Court as well. And historically, at least partially because of supremacy, the court tends to side with the national government. But not always. I've got two cases listed on this slide, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of a hint on them. I'm not going to give you too much, because some of the other activities that you can choose from in this unit include delving a little bit deeper into court cases. And so I want to pique your interest a little bit. Maybe these will be the cases you want to look at, but illustrate my point as well. So in the Raich case, Gonzalez versus Raich, 2005, and by the way, both of these cases have Gonzalez. That refers to Alberto Gonzalez, who was the U.S. Attorney General. And so these cases were brought on behalf of the U.S. government in his name. So it is the same Gonzalez. Gonzalez versus Raich, 2005, that's a California case dealing with their medical marijuana law. The Oregon case from 2006 deals with an Oregon law about physician-assisted suicide. That's what they call it. Basically, Oregon decriminalized the prescribing of medications by doctors if they knew a patient who was terminally ill, they were going to die, chose to use medications in a way other than how they are approved for prescription, that the doctor wouldn't be held liable. Okay, the national government brought suit against both states under the Controlled Substances Act. In one case, they sided with the feds. In the other case, they didn't. They sided with the state. I'm going to leave it to you to figure out which is which. But, so while they tend to side with the national, it's not universal. Sometimes they do side with the states. So which side do you think should have more power or influence or authority? There are basically two positions on this issue. One is what's called the states' rights position. This position uses it says that the Constitution is a contract really between the states and the national government. They said, we were a confederation, everybody was equal, and we gave up power to the national government. So this is an agreement between the states and the national government. And they'll point to the 10th Amendment, which says powers not delegated to the national government are reserved to the states. That's their justification. So if there's a dispute, they're going to tend to think, the states should win. Okay, so on the like all the marijuana issues out there in the country right now, a states' rightist would say, hey, that's the state's decision what to do about that. A nationalist, on the other hand, says, it's not a contract between the states and the national government. The Constitution doesn't say we the states, it says we the people. So it's a contract between the people of the United States and the national government. And so therefore you need this national unifying force of the national government. And they'll say that, the founders intended for the national government to grow in power and influence, or they wouldn't have given them the elastic clause. They wouldn't have given them the supremacy clause. Where do you fit on this continuum? And it is a bit of a continuum. I mean, for many people, it's situational. Personally, I think that it's marvelous that states can make laws that fit their values and their situation. But I also think that sometimes we need a little more uniformity. It just depends on the issue. Defense, definitely national issue. Licensing, depends on what the license is about. Should doctors be licensed across state borders for the whole country to practice, or should it still be left state by state by state? So where you fit on this may vary depending on the issue. But think about where you fit on this continuum. So here we are. We're at the what do you think questions. And these are the questions I want you to answer and prepare to talk with me about in your face-to-face interview with me. Question 1. Should the national government have more obligations to the states in this relationship, fewer, or is it about right? And why do you think the way you do on this? That question ties back to Lecture 1. Should we admit more states to the Union, or are we a good size? Is 50 a nice round number? What are the advantages or disadvantages to growing more? Is it a good thing that states coordinate policy with each other? Or does that negate the benefits of a federal system? Is there more advantage to states having individual policy, or is there more advantage to them coordinating policy with one another? And finally, what's your perspective on this relationship? Are you more a states' rightist? Are you more a nationalist? Or are you just not sure? And explain it. Talk to you soon. I look forward to our conversation.